So I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects. I'm here to talk to you today about some ways that you can improve your homemade pedal boards and maximize the sonic and tonal qualities of that pedal board. The first thing that I recommend to anybody doing their own pedal boards is the necessity of having a buffer in their signal. And buffers have caught a bad reputation in the past, but they're really valuable to have if you want to get the closest representation of your guitar plugged directly into your amplifier. One thing to recognize though with buffers is that not all are created equal, and buffers that are inside of pedals that are kind of doubling as being independent buffers and are also, for example, let's say a distortion pedal, those may not be the best buffers in order to drive a long line of cable effectively without introducing noise or having any degradation in the signal. So I typically recommend that people get isolated buffers that their only job is to buffer. And that is really important to have on the input of your system. So the first thing you plug into ideally would be an input buffer. And also the last thing that you would want to plug into should be an output buffer. In this way, you are controlling the most variables as far as inconsistencies on the pedal board, where every pedal has a different input and output impedance, and you're dealing with a variety of different variables that you really trying to avoid if you want to get the closest sound to your guitar plugged directly into your amp. So tip one, definitely invest in getting an input buffer and an output buffer, preferably dedicated, not something that's combined with a pedal that also has a buffering quality to it. A second tip that I would have is always go with soldered cables whenever possible. So if you have the means to buy a lot of these solderless cable kits, you can definitely afford to buy some of the solderable cable. And if you don't have the skill or technical ability to do it, there are a myriad of YouTube channels that offer assistance on how to solder, and it's pretty easy once you get the hang of it. I think if you did 10 plugs and soldered and terminated those, I think you'd be set, and I think you'd be a lot happier with the results. Really inexpensive cable to buy that is really easy and maneuverable on a pedal board would be the Mogami 2319. So I would say that would be the easiest to solder and to work with on a pedal board context. And as far as connectors, which are the 1/4-inch ends that you plug in the inputs and outputs of your pedals, a really great place to get those inexpensively is Orange County Speaker Repair.com, and they offer inexpensive 1/4-inch connectors, and they have pancake versions, which are the flatter versions of pedal board interconnectors that you see. They also have standard right angle and straight, depending on what your needs are. And I would recommend that pairing because it's very inexpensive, less than $1 a connector, and for the 2319 from Mogami, that's maybe 50 cents a foot. And it will be a much better result using soldered connection than it would to be using solderless. And the main reason why that is that you have a lot of resistance in a non-soldered line, and you also have a lot of exposure to elements that are possible in addition to some of the reliability issues that can occur as a result of not having a hard soldered connection between the cable and the plug. Okay, so tip 3. I get questions all the time about how to fasten my pedals to a pedal board in a way that won't make them end up all over their case when they're traveling. And the best I've found in order to keep pedals on the pedal board is using a product from 3M called Dual Lock. And Dual Lock comes in a lot of different densities, but I've actually found that the trick to getting the best lock, well, you will never ever have to worry about removing a pedal or having a pedal come off in an unwanted fashion, is to use 2 different densities of Dual Lock. So if you go to different retail stores that sell 3M products, you can see different patterns of the Dual Lock, and I usually go with 180 loops per square inch and pair that with 300 loops per square inch. And that locking mechanism of having those 2 offset styles of loops to achieve the Velcro is the most effective way to keep things down. And I actually measured it with a tool to measure how much pressure it takes to get them to release. And I think for most of these pedals, it's around 25 pounds per square inch. So if you're using 6 inches of cable, you can do the math. It's pretty difficult to get off there, so it'd really have to be mishandled in order to remove any of these pedals from the pedal board without you wanting to do it. So tip 4 is always invest whenever possible in an isolated power supply that has isolated outputs and preferably uses a toroid style transformer. On most of the pedal boards, I will typically use a Voodoo Lab power supply, but there are other companies that make power supplies that have toroid transformers. Other examples would be T-Rex, Seox. Those companies also use those style supplies, toroid transformers, and are typically a very low noise analog linear supply. There are some other companies that make supplies that have some isolated outputs that are also fairly good and have some switching capabilities as well, and don't require you to have to change power supplies if you're going to another country. So an example of that would be G-Lab out of Poland. They have also a very nice supply. And I would recommend looking into those to get the quietest results on your pedal board. Typically, if you have a supply where many of the outputs are in parallel, you can often get noise depending on which pedals are paired in parallel. And also, if an output goes down, typically you'll have the whole entire supply go down. And so this is just a much quieter and much more reliable way to do it, is to get a linear isolated supply like those companies that I mentioned. I think that you'll find that it decreases the noise and it increases the level of productivity that you can have with your board and not have to continue to figure out where the ghosts are coming from in your pedal board in reference to noise. So the next tip would be about dressing your cables in the appropriate way. And dressing has a lot to do with the longevity of your cable and also with how it's going to look as far as an aesthetic on your pedal board. One thing that you'll notice on most of my pedal boards is I never try to put any extreme bends on any cables. When you have a lot of really, really tight angles and the pedals are really close together, leaving a little bit of slack so that you don't have any really tight bends on any of the connections is really important. So I usually try to make sure that everything has a little bit of relief to it, and that, you know, if you move it around, maybe it'll move slightly, but it's not going to be like spaghetti on your pedal board. So you definitely want to leave enough relief in your pedals where maybe you can move it slightly, but you're not having a really intense angle. Maybe something like this would be kind of intense for that and probably wouldn't last long term. But if it has a little bit of relief, it's a little bit spongy, and yet it still sits down, it's tucked away, that's a really good way to do it. So really making sure that you don't have too hard of a break angle. That's really going to help preserve the life of your cables and ensure that they're going to last for years to come. So another thing to keep your pedal board really nice and neat is purchasing the right equipment to do so. And two important things that are just staples in my weekly orders of materials are zip ties and tie downs. Tie downs are the square adhesive mounting tools that allows me to tie down the cable with a zip tie and adhese it to the pedal board. This is something that's really useful to keep all of the pedal board cable tucked down and away from the pedal so it's not interfering with anything. Those are something that you can easily purchase at a hardware store like Home Depot or Lowe's. And the zip ties equally can be purchased in the same place. I usually find them in the electronics section, and you can purchase those there, and they're very effective at helping keep things organized and helping you kind of keep things tidy and neat. And one last tip that I'll give is about when you're dressing your cables, it's very important to try to isolate your instrument cables from your power cables. So a lot of times I'll see these beautifully built homemade pedal boards that are done on various platforms, but I'll see that the instrument cables and the power cables are dressed together. And that's a real no-no. Whenever possible, you want to make sure that your instrument cables and your power cables, if they're going to cross, you want to make sure that they do that in a perpendicular fashion. You never want them in parallel. So you really want to try to eliminate them being like right on top of each other in parallel. If you can space them out and be in parallel, that's acceptable. But if they're going to be right on top of each other, if you can make sure that they are perpendicular, that's going to cause the least amount of noise and the least amount of interference of any RF or any noise getting into your audio line. So you really want to try to keep those away from each other as often as possible. So those are the tips that I have to offer. You can visit my website for more information like this at vertexeffects.com.